So I've been reading George Saunders' A Swim in the Pond in the Rain, where he analyzes 7 Russian short stories and what makes them work as pieces of writing. He also shares quite a bit about his own writing process. As you know, George Saunders is a best-selling novelist. He's also a professor in the creative writing program at Syracuse University. So let's just jump right in with these 7 tips on writing from George Saunders. Tip number 1, a story is a linear temporal phenomenon. It proceeds and charms us, or it doesn't, one line at a time. I think George Saunders is reminding writers of something we tend to forget when we're writing a story, is that a story has to continually draw us in. It has to compel us to keep reading. It has to make our readers care about our characters and our story, because really, if you think about it, at any moment, a reader could just stop if they get a little bored and stop reading. So it has to have scenes that really hook readers. Scenes have to increase with escalating tensions that build to moments of crisis and climax where characters are put in situations with increasingly higher and higher stakes. I like what George Saunders says. As a writer, I don't have to worry about anything else but would a reasonable person reading line 4 get enough of a jolt to go on to line 5? And if they don't, I have to go back in the revision process to make some corrections and changes to give them that jolt to keep them going to line 5. Tip number 2, of all the questions an aspiring writer must ask themselves, here's the most urgent. What makes a reader keep reading? As George Saunders said, a story is a line-by-line phenomenon. And so I love this quote because it really reminds us of a simple truth that at any particular moment in a story, we have to ask ourselves, would a reader keep reading? Sometimes we might have a really good hook at the beginning of a scene, but then at some point in the scene, maybe early on or later in the scene, maybe it's the climax scene, maybe our story starts to lag or drag a little bit. And so, especially in the revision process, we have to look at, does our story at every moment keep a reader continuing to read? Tip number 3, when we're reading along and something deflects to the end needle, this tells us in the instant of writing, we weren't there. George Saunders has a really interesting method of revision. He imagines he has a meter stuck to his head, and there's a positive and a negative needle on the meter. I think he has an engineering background as an undergrad. And so basically what he does is he rereads what he's written as if he's reading it for the first time, and he tries to react to his text. So if it's positive, right, that means his text is good. But if the negative meter starts to drop, what he does is he tries to stop and really listen for a potential fix or correction to that part. I like this method because it's very similar to what I do, so it's very confirming when I read this in his book, A Swim. You ever wondered why some parts of your writing are better than others? George Saunders says that when the end needle begins to drop, it tells us something important, that in the moment of our writing, we weren't present. I think what he's saying here is that sometimes we're more attuned in our writing, and that's when our writing is the strongest. And when our writing is the weakest, it means that we're really not paying attention in the moment to what we're really trying to capture on a page. Tip number 4, who cares if a first draft is any good? It just needs to be so that you can revise it. I went through a phase recently where I began to freak out whenever I was doing a first draft. And I think I was falling into the trap where I wanted my first draft to be perfect. So I love what George Saunders says. He says, who cares if your first draft is any good? It just needs to be. And I love this quote because it's saying that you just need to get something down the page so that during the revision process, you have something to look at that you can react to. Using George Saunders' method, you can see what's positive, you can see what's negative, and you can make those little fixes and corrections during the revision process because you have something that you can react to. I found what George Saunders is saying to be really true in my own writing. You just have to get something down on a page because really it's in the second, third, and 5th and 10th draft where you're really beginning to fill out that scene with details and descriptions. So in the beginning, you just have to get something down on the page so you can look at, so you can see what's missing, so you can see what needs to be added, so you can see those little fixes and corrections that George Saunders talks about when you're revising. Tip number 5, what makes a piece of writing a story is that something happens within it that causes the characters to change forever. This is a good gut check type of quote. George Saunders says that for a story to be a story, it has to have characters who change forever. Sometimes we can write stories, and if the characters aren't changing, George Saunders would say it's not even a story. So I started looking at some of my scenes and seeing if in those scenes are my characters changing. I don't think a story always has to have big changes in every scene. Sometimes the best changes are little changes. And I've noticed in my book that a lot of times the little changes represent a trajectory of bigger change in one of my characters. One thing I've learned about how characters change is you have to be aware constantly of what is your main storyline, to be aware of how your character begins in a story and how they're gradually changing throughout the story. The same is true for a subplot. You have to know the characters in your subplot, kind of where they start out as a baseline and how you want to see them change. Tip number 6, in my view, all art begins in the instant of intuitive preference. This quote relates back to George Saunders' revision method, and as we reread our text, thinking about what we like, the positive meter, and what we don't like, the negative meter, and as we're doing that line by line micro editing, listening for those small fixes and corrections, George Saunders says what ultimately happens in all those decisions is we come up with our own preference, which represents our voice and our style over the course of all those different decisions we've made. And that's what separates us and makes us different from other writers. That's why the revision process is so important. As you're going over your text and micro-editing it over the course of hundreds of drafts, that's where your voice and your style comes in through your preferences as you make those micro-edits. So let me encourage you, if you're not a big fan of revision, why I think revision is so important. I love revision. I love going over my text 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 times because I find that even on my 40th time looking at a text, certain little details or little events and little thoughts or feelings come up that I didn't even think about on all those other times. So each time through, it's really a new time when you're looking at your writing because something's going to pop up in your head that surprises you. And that could be the magic of the scene. Tip number 7, big thematic decisions are going to be made naturally by way of thousands of decisions at the line level. I saw this same idea in Mary Karr's The Art of Memoir. If you just focus on the smaller, micro, line-by-line decisions, then George Saunders says the larger story will naturally emerge. I think this is really great advice for writers because a lot of times we're worried and we're thinking about our macro structure. Where's our plot going? Where's our story going? And what George Saunders and Mary Karr say, if you just focus on the micro details, if you take the scenes you're writing and you really just work at making those scenes better, again, it's all about revision. If you keep working on those scenes, one scene will just kind of naturally lead to another scene, and all of a sudden that bigger structure starts to naturally emerge. So there you have it, 7 tips on writing from George Saunders. And as always, thank you so much for watching. There's a link below if you want to check out more of my writing. Happy writing, everybody.